This episode is on the early life of Arthur Schopenhauer and how it affected him to become the greatest pessimistic philosopher the world has ever seen. Along with that, his entire philosophy will be narrated to you in a calm and soothing tone. So, just sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Arthur Schopenhauer was born on February 22nd, 1788, in Danzig, a city that was then part of Prussia, now Poland. He was the eldest of three children in a prosperous family. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, was a successful merchant, and his mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, was a well-known writer and intellectual. From an early age, Arthur was exposed to literature, philosophy, and the world of business, receiving a rigorous education at home. His early years were marked by a tension between his parents' differing expectations. His father wanted him to enter commerce, following in his footsteps, while his mother encouraged a literary and intellectual path. Heinrich emphasized practicality and self-reliance, instilling in Arthur a strong sense of discipline, while Johanna nurtured his curiosity and love for reading. This dual influence shaped the foundation of his later philosophical thinking, blending an awareness of the material world with a deep engagement in intellectual inquiry. In 1805, Schopenhauer enrolled at the University of Göttingen to study medicine, but his interests soon shifted toward philosophy. He was particularly drawn to the works of Plato, Immanuel Kant, and the post-Kantian idealists. The intellectual climate of the university exposed him to rigorous debate, fostering a critical mind and a tendency toward independent thought. During these formative years, Schopenhauer also traveled extensively, spending time in France and other parts of Europe. These travels broadened his perspective and exposed him to different cultures, languages, and philosophical traditions. By the time he returned to Germany, he had developed a clear sense of intellectual purpose and a conviction that philosophy, rather than commerce, would be his life's work. His early life, marked by familial tension, intellectual stimulation, and personal exploration, laid the groundwork for the pessimistic and deeply reflective philosophy that would later define him. The world is my representation. This is a truth valid for every living and knowing being, although man alone can bring it into reflective, abstract consciousness. And if he really does so, philosophic vision has dawned on him. It then becomes clear to him that he knows no sun and no earth, but always only a seeing eye that sees a sun, a hand that feels an earth, that the world around him is there only as representation. In other words, only in relation to another being, the representer, which is himself. If any truth can be asserted a priori, it is this, for it is the expression of the most general form of all possible and thinkable experience, a form that is more universal than time, space, and causality, for all these presuppose it. Without the subject, this whole world as object would not exist. This is the first fundamental thought in Schopenhauer's philosophy, a radical reinterpretation of Kant's idealism. For Schopenhauer, the world as representation is fundamentally phenomenal, a mere appearance, conditioned by the forms of our intellect, space, time, and causality. These are not properties of things in themselves, but rather innate structures of our perception and understanding, through which we organize the raw data of experience. What we perceive, therefore, is not reality as it is, but reality as it appears to us, filtered and structured by our cognitive faculties. This is not to say the world is an illusion in the common sense, but rather that our access to it is always mediated. The table before me, the chair I sit on, the sounds I hear, are all representations formed within my consciousness. They are objects for a subject, and this subject, the knowing individual, is precisely the point from which all knowledge begins and to which it eventually returns. This emphasis on the subjective nature of experience immediately distinguishes Schopenhauer from a naive realism that assumes direct access to an objective, independent world. He argues that our very concept of objectivity is built upon the intersubjective agreement of multiple subjects, each experiencing their own representations. But this leads to a crucial question. If the entire world of experience is merely representation, what lies beyond it? Is there anything at all that exists independently of our minds? Schopenhauer answers this by introducing his concept of the will. The world as representation, despite its phenomenal nature, is not empty or arbitrary. It is the manifestation of something that lies deeper, something that he calls the will. This will is not merely the individual volitions we experience daily, my desire for food, your intention to speak, but a singular, blind, irrational, ceaseless striving that constitutes the ultimate reality of everything. It is the thing in itself, the inner essence of the world, that which Kant deemed unknowable. Schopenhauer claims we do have access to the thing in itself, not through external perception, but through introspection. When we observe our own bodies, we see them as objects in space and time, subject to causality, just like any other object. But we also have an immediate inner awareness of our own volitions, our desires, our efforts. This inner experience, our will, is felt directly, not as a representation, but as the very essence of our being. My hand moves because I will it to move. The representation of the moving hand is merely the objectification of my immediate underlying act of will. Through this unique insight, Schopenhauer bridges the gap between the world as representation and the thing in itself. He asserts that our own body is the key to understanding the entire world. My body is both a representation and object among objects, and simultaneously the direct objectification of my will. Therefore, by analogy, he posits that the entire objective world, all of nature, every stone, every tree, every animal, every human being, is also an objectification of this single universal will. It is the will that manifests itself at different levels of objectification, from the most rudimentary forces of nature to the complex organization of organic life, and finally to the conscious intellect of man. This will, however, is not rational or purposive. It is a primal, unceasing urge, a blind impulse that strives for existence, for more life, for perpetuation. It is a will to live, devoid of ultimate meaning or goal. This is a profoundly pessimistic turn in his philosophy, setting him apart from the optimistic rationalism of many of his predecessors. The world, when understood through the lens of the will, is revealed to be a battleground of conflicting strivings, a realm of perpetual suffering. Because the will is infinite and its objectifications finite, and because every objectification is merely a temporary manifestation of this restless striving, satisfaction is always fleeting. Every attained goal merely clears the way for a new desire, a new lack, a new form of suffering. This ceaseless oscillation between desire and boredom, between striving and temporary fulfillment, constitutes the fundamental pattern of existence. Even the intellect, the highest manifestation of the will in humans, is ultimately subservient to it. Reason and knowledge for Schopenhauer are not ends in themselves, but tools developed by the will to better achieve its own ends of perpetuation and survival. This explains why, despite our intellect, we often act irrationally, driven by deep-seated desires and impulses that our reason merely rationalizes after the fact. The intellect is a mere lantern carried by the will, illuminating only a small path ahead, while the vast, unconscious, irrational power of the will drives the entire journey. This leads to the conclusion that life, at its core, is suffering. The very nature of the will is striving, and striving implies a lack and incompleteness. To exist is to desire, and to desire is to suffer from not having. Even when a desire is fulfilled, boredom quickly sets in, leading to new desires and new suffering. There is no ultimate satisfaction, no final goal towards which the will is striving. It simply strives for the sake of striving, perpetuating a cycle of endless want. The more conscious a being is, the more intensely it experiences this suffering, making human beings particularly prone to existential anguish. This fundamental pessimism permeates every aspect of his system, from his ethics to his aesthetics. He sees the world as a place of ceaseless struggle, a constant bellum omnium contra omnes, or war of all against all, where life feeds on life and suffering is the common denominator. Even love, typically seen as a source of joy, is revealed by Schopenhauer as merely the will's cunning device to ensure the propagation of the species, a deceptive impulse that leads individuals into the service of a higher, blind purpose, only to leave them dissatisfied once its biological imperative is fulfilled. This bleak vision, however, is not without its potential for liberation, a topic he addresses through his ideas on asceticism and the denial of the will. Schopenhauer's philosophy, despite its profound pessimism, offers avenues for temporary alleviation from the suffering inherent in the will's ceaseless striving. These avenues are primarily found in aesthetic contemplation and, more radically, in ascetic practices leading to the denial of the will. Aesthetic contemplation, for Schopenhauer, provides a momentary escape from the tyranny of the will. When we engage with art, be it music, painting, sculpture, or poetry, we transcend our individual perspective, our personal desires, and our practical concerns. In that moment, we cease to be individuals driven by the will. Instead, we become a pure, will-less subject of knowledge, a mirror of the object, contemplating the Platonic idea embodied within the work of art. The Platonic ideas in Schopenhauer's system are the universal, archetypal forms that exist outside of time and space, representing the various grades of the will's objectification. For instance, in a beautiful landscape painting, one perceives not merely a specific collection of trees and hills, but the universal idea of tree or landscape as a manifestation of the will at a particular grade. When the intellect, liberated from its servitude to the individual will, detaches itself from personal interests and becomes absorbed entirely in the contemplation of these ideas, it experiences a state of pure knowing. This state is characterized by profound peace, tranquility, and a temporary cessation of the ceaseless cycle of desire and suffering. The object of aesthetic contemplation is not the particular individual thing, but its essential eternal form, its idea. Music holds a unique and preeminent position in Schopenhauer's aesthetics. Unlike other art forms, which are objectifications of the will at various grades, i.e. they represent Platonic ideas, music, he argues, is a direct objectification of the will itself, prior to its objectification in ideas. Music expresses the inner essence of the world, the ebb and flow of desire, suffering, joy, and sorrow, directly and universally, without the mediation of concepts or representations of the phenomenal world. It is the will's direct voice. Listening to music, therefore, can evoke the deepest feelings and insights, providing the most profound and immediate liberation from the individual will. In this state, we transcend individuality and connect directly with the universal will, experiencing a sense of unity and timelessness that momentarily stills the torment of individual desire. However, these moments of aesthetic bliss are always temporary. As soon as the contemplation ceases, the individual is dragged back into the service of their own will, re-entering the cycle of desire, pain, and boredom. Therefore, while art offers a precious respite, it does not provide a permanent solution to the problem of suffering. For a more radical and lasting liberation, Schopenhauer turns to ethics and asceticism, leading to the denial of the will to live. Ethics for Schopenhauer is not about external rules or divine commands, but about recognizing the fundamental identity of the will in all beings. The primary ethical impulse arises from compassion, or Mitleid, when we truly understand that the suffering we experience is the same suffering that pervades all existence, and that the will driving us is the same will animating every other being. A sense of universal interconnectedness emerges. We recognize ourselves in others, and their pain becomes our own. This deep empathy, this Mitleid, is the foundation of all genuine morality. It motivates us to act justly, to alleviate suffering, and to overcome egoism, which is merely the individual will asserting itself against others. The just person, the compassionate person, sees through the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation that separates one being from another in the phenomenal world, and apprehends the underlying unity of the will. However, even compassion, while noble, only mitigates suffering. It does not eradicate its source. The ultimate path to liberation lies in the radical denial of the will to live. This denial involves an active, conscious turning away from all desires, pleasures, and attachments that bind one to the phenomenal world and, by extension, to the will. It is a path of asceticism, self-abnegation, and voluntary suffering. This ascetic path manifests in various forms: poverty, chastity, fasting, self-mortification, and a profound detachment from worldly possessions and social status. The ascetic understands that all desire leads to suffering, and therefore systematically works to extinguish desire itself. They recognize the futility of pursuing happiness in a world governed by a blind, irrational will. The highest expression of this denial is found in figures like the Hindu ascetic, the Buddhist saint, or the Christian mystic who embraces poverty and renounces worldly life. Through this rigorous self-discipline, the ascetic gradually weakens the grip of the will upon their individual manifestation. They begin to experience a profound sense of resignation, tranquility, and inner peace, a state Schopenhauer calls nirvana in an echo of Buddhist thought. This is not the annihilation of the individual, but the cessation of the individual will's striving. It is a state where the veil of Maya, the world of representation and illusion, is pierced, and the underlying unity and suffering of the universal will are fully apprehended, leading to a conscious turning away from it. The ultimate goal of this denial is not death, but a life lived without desire, without attachment, a life of profound serenity that transcends the ceaseless torment of the will. When the individual will ceases to affirm itself, the suffering associated with it also ceases. This is the only true form of redemption in Schopenhauer's worldview, a liberation from the endless cycle of birth, suffering, and death. It is a radical departure from the common of happiness and fulfillment, positing that true peace lies in the cessation of all striving, in a profound quietude that transcends the very notion of individuality. The denial of the will is the ultimate act of freedom and a conscious rejection of the blind force that drives all existence, a leap beyond the world of phenomena into a state of profound nothingness, which, from the perspective of the affirmed will, appears as oblivion, but from the perspective of the liberated individual is true peace and ultimate freedom. This path is arduous and rare, but it represents the highest human potential for escaping the universal suffering inherent in existence. It transforms the world, which is a hell for the affirmed will, into a place of contemplation and release for those who deny it. This denial of the will also profoundly shapes Schopenhauer's views on free will and determinism. He argues against the notion of absolute free will, contending that human actions are ultimately determined by character, which itself is an expression of the individual's underlying will. We are free to do what we will, but we are not free to will what we will. Our character is given, unchangeable, and our actions flow necessarily from it when confronted with specific motives. However, the true freedom lies in the possibility of negating the will itself, not in choosing one action over another within the realm of determined actions. This freedom is metaphysical, a freedom from the will, not a freedom within its domain. It is the freedom to change one's entire mode of being, to move from affirmation to denial, a single decisive act of self-overcoming that is not bound by empirical causality. This is the only form of true freedom possible. The unchangeable character determined by the will is the empirical side. The possibility of denying that will is the transcendental side. It is a freedom achieved through insight into the nature of reality and a subsequent radical shift in one's relationship to the world and to oneself. This freedom is not about choosing options, but about fundamentally altering one's being. Schopenhauer's philosophical system also delves deeply into the nature of the intellect, consciousness, and the peculiar relationship between the human brain and the universal will. While the intellect is the highest and most complex manifestation of the will in humans, it is not an independent entity. Rather, it is an organ, a tool developed by the will for its own purposes, primarily for the preservation and propagation of the individual and the species. Just as claws and teeth are adaptations for survival, so too is the intellect. Its primary function is to perceive, understand, and navigate the world of representation in order to satisfy the will's endless desires. This subservient role of the intellect is crucial. Unlike many rationalist philosophers who elevate reason to the highest faculty, Schopenhauer argues that the intellect is secondary to the will. The will is the primary, fundamental reality, a blind, irrational force. The intellect, with its capacity for knowledge, reasoning, and abstract thought, is merely a phenomenal expression, a supervening phenomenon that arises from the highly complex organization of the brain. The brain itself is the most elaborate objectification of the will, designed to serve its purposes. It is the will, not the intellect, that drives us and motivates us and ultimately determines our actions. Our conscious reasoning often serves merely to rationalize what the will has already decided on an unconscious level. This explains why we frequently find ourselves driven by desires and impulses that defy logical explanation, and why our rational arguments often fail to sway deeply ingrained beliefs or passions. The intellect, for all its sophistication, is a relatively late development in the evolutionary process, a delicate and dependent faculty that requires the support of the body and the constant maintenance of the will to function. It is a mere lantern that the will carries to illuminate its path, but the will itself is the traveler, the driving force. This also explains the limits of human knowledge. Since the intellect is bound by the forms of space, time, and causality, it can only ever grasp the world as representation. It cannot fully comprehend the will itself, which lies beyond these forms. It can only infer the will's nature through introspection and through its manifestations in the phenomenal world. The will, as the thing in itself, is ultimately unknowable in its entirety through conceptual thought, though it is immediately felt. This distinction between the will and the intellect has profound implications for understanding human nature. Our conscious thoughts and rational deliberations are often merely the surface phenomena, the ripples on the vast, unconscious ocean of the will. Dreams, instincts, emotions, and even mental illness are seen as direct expressions of the will, operating beneath or beyond the control of the intellect. Genius, too, is reinterpreted within this framework. For Schopenhauer, genius is not merely a higher degree of intellect, but a qualitative difference. The genius possesses an intellect that, to some extent, manages to escape its subservience to the individual will. Instead of being solely focused on practical concerns and serving the needs of the individual, the genius's intellect is capable of purely objective contemplation, of perceiving the Platonic ideas directly, unclouded by personal desires or interests. This capacity for detached objectiving is what allows the genius to create great works of art, to make profound scientific discoveries, or to achieve deep philosophical insights. The genius is, in a sense, a pure, will-less subject of knowing, to a greater degree than the average person, allowing them to glimpse the universal and eternal truths that ordinary intellects, bound by their individual will, tend to overlook. However, this liberation from the will's service also comes with a price. The genius often finds it difficult to navigate the mundane world of everyday life, to attend to practical matters, or to integrate socially. Their detachment from the individual will can manifest as a certain aloofness, eccentricity, or even a degree of impracticality. The very qualities that enable profound insight can hinder adaptation to the ordinary demands of existence. Madness, too, is understood in relation to the will and intellect. Schopenhauer suggests that mental illness can arise when the intellect, unable to cope with particularly painful or unbearable knowledge, seeks to suppress or distort it. This lesion of the intellect, or rupture in its capacity to process reality, leads to delusion and irrationality. The will, in its desperate attempt to preserve the individual, might force the intellect to construct alternative realities to escape unbearable truths. This perspective offers a compassionate, if deterministic, view of mental suffering, seeing it as a defensive mechanism of the organism rather than a moral failing. Furthermore, Schopenhauer's philosophy provides a unique perspective on death. For the individual, death appears to be the ultimate annihilation, the end of consciousness and being. However, from the perspective of the will, death is merely the dissolution of a particular objectification, a temporary form. The will itself is immortal, eternal, and continues to manifest itself in new forms. While the individual consciousness ceases, the underlying will that animated it continues its ceaseless striving. In this sense, death is not an absolute end, but a transformation, a recycling of the fundamental life force. This provides a strange form of solace, as it implies that the suffering will persists, but the individual experiencing that particular configuration of suffering ceases. The body, as a representation, perishes, but the will that constituted its essence remains. This leads to the idea of a metaphysical persistence, where while the individual dies, the will itself is not subject to the forms of time and space and therefore remains eternal. The individual, in their conscious form, is a fleeting phenomenon, but the substratum of their being, the will, is imperishable. This concept offers a different take on immortality, not of personal consciousness, but of the underlying cosmic force. It is not a comforting thought in the traditional sense, as it implies the continuation of suffering in new forms, but it negates the absolute finality often associated with death. The cycle of birth and death is merely the ebb and flow of the universal will, manifesting and withdrawing its particular objectifications. Thus, in Schopenhauer's view, the intellect, consciousness, and even the phenomenon of death are deeply intertwined with the fundamental nature of the will. They are all expressions, tools, or transformations within the grand, tragic drama of the will's ceaseless affirmation and its painful striving. The intellect, though capable of profound insights and moments of liberation, remains ultimately bound to this underlying force, its potential for true freedom lying only in its capacity to recognize and ultimately deny the very will that brought it into being. This is the ultimate paradox of his philosophy. The highest product of the will, the intellect, is also the only means by which the will can be consciously understood and ultimately negated. Schopenhauer's philosophy, while deeply metaphysical, also extended its pessimistic gaze to the realms of society, politics, and the human condition as experienced in daily life. His views on human relationships, government, and the general state of the world are direct consequences of his fundamental understanding of the will. Since all individuals are ultimately objectifications of the same blind, egoistic will, human relationships are inherently fraught with conflict and self-interest. Each individual will strives for its own assertion, its own perpetuation, often at the expense of others. This inherent egoism leads to a perpetual struggle, a war of all against all, as he, echoing Hobbes, describes the natural state of humanity. Society, therefore, is not a natural or harmonious aggregation, but a necessary construct, an artificial arrangement designed to curb the destructive impulses of individual wills. Laws, governments, and ethical codes are merely pragmatic instruments to regulate the conflicts that inevitably arise from this clashing of egoistic wills. They exist not to foster genuine harmony or collective good in an idealistic sense, but to prevent absolute chaos and ensure a minimal level of security and order. Justice, in this context, is primarily retributive. It is about preventing and punishing violations of individual rights, which are merely boundaries established to prevent one will from completely encroaching upon another. The state exists to enforce these boundaries and prevent individuals from being utterly consumed by the rapaciousness of others. This is a far cry from any utopian vision of society. Schopenhauer saw little hope for radical social improvement or the perfectibility of humankind through political means. Given that the fundamental nature of existence is the irrational, suffering will, any social arrangement will inevitably reflect this underlying reality. Political revolutions, for instance, might change the external form of government, but they cannot alter the intrinsic egoism and suffering that permeate human nature. Therefore, real change must come from within, from the individual's recognition and denial of the will, not from external political reforms. His views on love and sexuality are particularly stark and controversial. For Schopenhauer, romantic love, often idealized as a sublime emotion, is merely the will's most cunning and deceptive trick to ensure procreation. The intense attraction between two individuals is not driven by personal affection or mutual understanding, but by the unconscious imperative of the species to perpetuate itself. The individuals involved are merely instruments of the species' will. Once the biological purpose of procreation is fulfilled, or even just the possibility of it in courtship, the intense, intoxicating feelings often subside, revealing the underlying egoism and potential for disillusionment. The individuals were drawn together not for their own sake, but for the sake of the next generation, a generation that will in turn be driven by the same blind will and condemned to the same cycle of suffering. Marriage, therefore, is rarely based on genuine, lasting affection, but rather on convenience, social pressure, or the fading illusion of romantic love. Happiness in marriage is rare because the driving force behind it, the reproductive urge of the species, often leaves the individuals feeling used and unsatisfied once its purpose is achieved. This profoundly cynical view reduces human relationships to a biological imperative, stripping them of much of their perceived emotional and spiritual depth. He saw the very act of bringing children into the world as a profound affirmation of the will to live, a perpetuation of suffering, and thus, from his ultimate philosophical perspective, an ethically questionable act, unless undertaken with a conscious denial of the will's desires. In his writings, Schopenhauer often expresses contempt for the masses, for common humanity, whom he saw as largely driven by base instincts and superficial concerns, incapable of higher thought or genuine insight into the nature of reality. He believed that only a rare few, Those capable of transcending their individual will through aesthetic contemplation or ascetic practice could glimpse the truth and achieve liberation. This elitism, combined with his generally misanthropic tone, made him a figure often admired by intellectual outcasts and pessimists. He saw the world as a large hospital where every individual is a patient undergoing some form of suffering, and life itself is merely a constant effort to postpone death, only to fall prey to it eventually. This world is the worst of all possible worlds, not in a crude empirical sense, but in the metaphysical sense that any world less imperfect, less miserable, could not exist. If it were even slightly better, the will to live, in its insatiable striving, would quickly bring it to a worse state. This notion contrasts sharply with Leibniz's idea of this being the best of all possible worlds. For Schopenhauer, the very existence of a world driven by a blind, irrational will necessitates suffering. If suffering were eliminated, the will would lose its primary drive, and the world itself would dissolve into nothingness. Therefore, the suffering is not an accidental feature, but an intrinsic characteristic of existence. His philosophy also touches upon the role of women in society, a topic on which his views are famously misogynistic. He considered women to be intellectually inferior, primarily suited for childbearing and domestic duties, and driven more by instinct and appearance than by reason. He viewed their charm as a deceptive mechanism of the species' will to lure men into procreation. While these views reflect the prejudices of his time, they also stem from his larger philosophical framework. He saw women as more directly embodying the blind, irrational will to live, less capable of the intellectual detachment necessary for philosophical contemplation or the denial of the will. This aspect of his work has been rightly criticized, yet it is consistent with his broader, pessimistic assessment of humanity and the will's pervasive influence. Ultimately, Schopenhauer presents a deeply unflattering portrait of the human condition and society. He views human beings as fundamentally driven by self-interest and suffering, perpetually at odds with one another, and living in a world devoid of inherent meaning or purpose. The only relief from this bleak reality comes not from reforming the external world or improving social conditions, but from an internal, radical shift in one's relationship to the pervasive will, culminating in its denial. Society and politics are thus merely temporary expedients, necessary compromises in a world doomed by its very nature to perpetual strife and unhappiness. The true battle and the true possibility of freedom lies within the individual soul, in its capacity to revolt against the tyrannical demands of the will that animates all existence. He leaves humanity with a stark choice: either embrace the blind affirmation of the will and endure endless suffering, or seek liberation through its denial, a path leading to a profound, quietistic peace that transcends the world itself. Schopenhauer's influence, despite his initial obscurity, grew significantly in the late 19th and 20th centuries, deeply affecting philosophy, literature, and psychology. His radical shift from rationalist optimism to a pessimistic, will-centered metaphysics resonated with thinkers grappling with the implications of scientific advancements and the perceived decline of traditional religious belief. He is often seen as a precursor to existentialism, particularly in his emphasis on suffering, the irrationality of existence, and the individual's struggle for meaning in a world devoid of inherent purpose. While he did not use the term existentialism, his focus on the primacy of the will, the absurdity of life, and the individual's subjective experience of anguish laid much of the groundwork for later existentialist thinkers like Nietzsche, Kierkegaard. Though Kierkegaard precedes him chronologically, their themes often converge, and Camus. His idea that the world is my representation foreshadows phenomenological approaches, while his emphasis on the irrational, unconscious will anticipates Freudian and Jungian psychology. Sigmund Freud's concept of the Ideid, the primal, unconscious drives that motivate human behavior, bears a striking resemblance to Schopenhauer's will. Freud acknowledged Schopenhauer's insights, noting how the philosopher had already understood much about the unconscious desires and motivations that drive human action, long before psychoanalysis provided a clinical framework for them. Carl Jung, similarly, found resonance in Schopenhauer's ideas about the collective unconscious and archetypes, seeing the will as a driving force behind these universal patterns of human experience. Beyond psychology, Schopenhauer's philosophy exerted a profound impact on artists and writers. His pessimistic worldview, his insights into human suffering, and his appreciation for art as a means of temporary escape from the will found fertile ground in the Romantic and Symbolist movements. Writers like Thomas Hardy, Leo Tolstoy, and Joseph Conrad explored themes of fate, suffering, and the futility of human striving that echoed Schopenhauerian ideas. Richard Wagner, the composer, was profoundly influenced by Schopenhauer, particularly after reading The World as Will and Representation. Wagner's operas, especially Tristan and Isolde and Parsifal, are deeply permeated by Schopenhauerian themes of the will, suffering, renunciation, and the tragic nature of love and existence. The idea of music as a direct expression of the will itself, bypassing the intellect and representing the innermost essence of the world, was particularly formative for Wagner's conception of the music drama. Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps Schopenhauer's most famous intellectual heir, initially admired him deeply, seeing him as a rare truth-teller who dared to confront the unpleasant realities of existence. Nietzsche's early work, Untimely Meditations, includes an essay praising Schopenhauer as an educator who taught him intellectual honesty and the courage to live without illusions. However, Nietzsche eventually diverged sharply from his mentor, particularly on the concept of the will and the path to liberation. While Schopenhauer advocated the denial of the will to live as the ultimate goal, Nietzsche famously countered with the will to power, urging an affirmation of life, even its suffering, and a striving for self-overcoming. Nietzsche criticized Schopenhauer's pessimism as a form of nihilism and a weakness that sought escape rather than engagement with life's challenges. Despite this break, the very force of Nietzsche's rejection demonstrates the depth of Schopenhauer's influence. Nietzsche wrestled with Schopenhauer's ideas for much of his intellectual life, and many of his concepts, even those that contradict Schopenhauer, are formulated in response to him. Furthermore, Schopenhauer's ideas gained traction in Eastern thought, particularly in India, where his philosophy resonated with certain aspects of Buddhism and Hinduism, especially their emphasis on suffering dukkha, the illusory nature of the phenomenal world Maya, the cyclical nature of existence samsara, and the concept of liberation nirvana or moksha through the cessation of desire. Schopenhauer himself studied Hindu and Buddhist texts and incorporated elements of them into his philosophy, believing he had found ancient corroboration for his own insights. This mutual influence created a fascinating bridge between Western and Eastern philosophical traditions. In contemporary philosophy, Schopenhauer's ideas continue to be relevant. His emphasis on the unconscious drives, the embodied nature of mind, and the limits of rational thought anticipate many themes in contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive science. His stark portrayal of human suffering and the meaninglessness of existence still resonates in existentialist and nihilistic currents of thought. While his misogyny and some of his scientific conjectures have been rightly dismissed, his core metaphysical insights regarding the will and its relationship to the world of representation remain powerful and provocative. He challenged the anthropocentric biases of Western philosophy, placing humanity not as the pinnacle of creation, but as a particularly complex manifestation of a blind universal force. His work compels us to look beyond the surface of appearances and confront the raw, irrational forces that truly drive existence. His legacy is not just in the specific doctrines he articulated, but in the profound shift he initiated in Western thought, moving it away from naive optimism and towards a more realistic, albeit often bleak, assessment of the human condition. He forced philosophers to confront the dark side of existence, the irrationality that underlies seemingly rational behavior, and the pervasive suffering that permeates life. For those seeking a deeper understanding of human motivation and the nature of reality beyond conventional appearances, Schopenhauer's challenging and unsettling philosophy continues to offer profound insights, making him one of the most original and influential thinkers in the history of Western thought. His rigorous, systematic approach to pessimism, combined with his elegant prose, ensured his lasting place in the philosophical canon, even among those who ultimately reject his conclusions. He carved out a unique space for a philosophy that embraced the tragic, the irrational, and the suffering as central to the human experience. rather than as mere deviations from an otherwise harmonious order. His voice remains a potent and often uncomfortable presence in the philosophical conversation, forever reminding us of the dark undercurrents of the will. The intellectual lineage of Schopenhauer often positions him in a unique relation to his predecessors and successors, particularly with regard to German idealism, from which he consciously diverged. He saw himself as the true heir to Kant, claiming to have completed what Kant had left unfinished, especially concerning the nature of the thing in itself. While Kant argued that the noumenal world, the world of things in themselves, was ultimately unknowable and inaccessible to human reason, Schopenhauer asserted that we do have direct access to it, albeit through introspection and the experience of our own will. For Schopenhauer, the will is the Kantian thing in itself, revealed to us immediately in our own self-consciousness as the essence of our being. This move was a radical departure from Kant's agnosticism, transforming the unknowable into the most intimately known aspect of reality. He famously criticized his contemporaries, particularly Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, dismissing their philosophies as sophistry, obscurantism, and mere professorial philosophy, designed for career advancement rather than genuine truth-seeking. He viewed Hegel's dialectical system as a convoluted attempt to rationalize the world, ultimately serving as a tool for political conformity, in stark contrast to his own uncompromising pursuit of an unpalatable truth. Schopenhauer saw their systems as ultimately optimistic and rationalistic, failing to grasp the fundamental irrationality and suffering inherent in the will. This intellectual antagonism set him apart from the mainstream of 19th century German philosophy and contributed to his initial isolation and lack of recognition. His work was often seen as anachronistic or simply too negative by those steeped in the prevailing Hegelian current. Yet, it was precisely this independence and willingness to challenge intellectual orthodoxies that later attracted thinkers who felt stifled by the dominant philosophical trends. His rigorous, often acerbic critiques of his contemporaries underscore his commitment to what he perceived as a genuine, unvarnished confrontation with reality. For Schopenhauer, philosophy was not a comforting balm, but a painful revelation. His method, while systematic, was driven by a deep intuitive insight into the nature of human experience, particularly its darker aspects. He placed a strong emphasis on direct observation of life and introspection, rather than solely on abstract logical deduction. He drew widely from diverse sources: ancient Greek philosophy Plato, the Stoics, Indian philosophy Upanishads, Buddhism, and even contemporary scientific discoveries, to build a comprehensive metaphysical system. His style of writing was remarkably clear, forceful, and elegant, a stark contrast to the often dense and obscure prose of his German idealist rivals. This lucidity, combined with his frequent use of aphorisms and vivid metaphors, made his work highly readable and accessible to a broader audience once it finally gained traction. He saw himself as a writer of literature as much as a philosopher, valuing clarity and persuasive power in his argumentation. His essays, such as On the Suffering of the World or On the Vanity of Existence, are literary masterpieces that convey his profound pessimism with compelling force. The ethical dimension of Schopenhauer's philosophy, rooted in compassion and Mitleid, offers a fascinating counterpoint to the prevailing egoism of the will. While the will itself is blind and self-serving, the capacity for compassion arises when the intellect momentarily transcends the principium individuationis and recognizes the underlying unity of all suffering beings. This empathetic identification with the pain of others is the sole true moral motivation, according to Schopenhauer. It is not based on reason, utility, or divine command, but on an immediate, intuitive understanding that the suffering of another is, in essence, one's own. This compassion leads to acts of justice and benevolence, not because they promise reward or are dictated by law, but because they alleviate a suffering that is universally shared. However, even compassion, while noble, still operates within the realm of the will, albeit in a more enlightened form. It seeks to mitigate suffering, not to eradicate its root cause. The ultimate ethical path, therefore, goes beyond compassion to the denial of the will to live itself. This is the path of the saint, the ascetic, who consciously turns away from all affirmation of the will, including the desire for pleasure, the perpetuation of life, and the very act of willing, Such a person sees through the illusion of individuality and the endless cycle of desire and suffering. They understand that true peace lies in ceasing to strive, in a profound quietism that transcends the phenomenal world. This radical asceticism is the highest ethical ideal, leading to a state of profound peace or nirvana, where the individual will, having recognized its own futility and the suffering it perpetuates, consciously negates itself. This is not suicide, which Schopenhauer viewed as an affirmation of the will, a desire for a better life. Just not this one, but a slow, deliberate starvation of the will, a turning away from all that sustains its activity. The denial of the will, therefore, is the ultimate ethical act, a liberation from the cosmic tragedy. It is the only true freedom in a world otherwise governed by determinism. By choosing to deny the will, the individual transcends the very conditions of their existence, stepping outside the cycle of suffering and becoming an exception to the rule of nature. This is a heroic act of self-overcoming, not through affirmation, as Nietzsche would later propose, but through absolute renunciation. This profound ethical vision, leading to a kind of mystical quietism, stands in stark contrast to the more conventional ethical systems that emphasize duties, rights, or the pursuit of happiness within the world. For Schopenhauer, true ethics is about escaping the world and its inherent suffering, not about optimizing life within it. It's a path for the few, a difficult and often lonely journey that demands profound self-awareness and an unwavering commitment to truth, no matter how bleak. The denial of the will represents the ultimate triumph over the blind, irrational force that animates all existence, offering a glimpse of a state of being beyond the reach of suffering. It is a path of ultimate detachment, of shedding all illusions and achieving a profound peace that the world in its ceaseless striving can never provide. This, then, is the apex of his philosophy, offering a radical solution to the problem of suffering that defines the human condition. Schopenhauer's philosophy, while deeply rooted in metaphysics, also has significant implications for understanding human psychology, particularly regarding the nature of emotion, motivation, and consciousness. He argued that emotions are not merely fleeting mental states, but direct manifestations of the will, providing a window into its powerful, often irrational workings. Desires, fears, joys, and sorrows are all expressions of the will's affirmation or frustration. When the will is affirmed, we experience pleasure. When it is frustrated, we experience pain and suffering. This makes emotions far more fundamental than reasoned thought in shaping human behavior. He saw pleasure as merely the temporary cessation of desire, a momentary relief from the pain of striving, rather than a positive good in itself. True and lasting happiness, he concluded, is impossible in a world driven by the will, because satisfaction is always fleeting, and every fulfilled desire merely gives rise to new ones. This explains the pervasive sense of dissatisfaction in human life, the constant oscillation between wanting and boredom. Even the highest achievements and deepest joys are ultimately ephemeral, offering only a temporary reprieve from the inherent suffering of existence. Our entire lives, he suggests, are a constant struggle to ward off pain and boredom, to fill the void of our restless will. Humor, for Schopenhauer, is a unique intellectual phenomenon that also provides a temporary escape from the seriousness of the will's struggle. Laughter arises from the sudden, unexpected perception of an incongruity between a concept and the real object subsumed under it. It is a moment where the intellect, in its capacity to categorize and conceptualize, encounters a contradiction that releases attention, providing a fleeting moment of relief and amusement. This intellectual play, like aesthetic contemplation, momentarily liberates the intellect from its servitude to the will, offering a brief respite from the earnestness of life. However, like all such reprieves, it is short-lived. The individual soon returns to the grip of their desires and the inevitable cycle of suffering. Sleep and dreams also play a significant role in Schopenhauer's understanding of consciousness. Sleep, for him, is not merely a physical necessity, but a profound psychological phenomenon where the intellect, the organ of the brain, is temporarily relieved from its arduous task of forming representations and serving the will in the waking world. During sleep, the individual will, which never ceases its activity, can express itself more directly and uninhibitedly through dreams. Dreams are not random, but manifestations of the will's deeper impulses, anxieties, and unfulfilled desires, often operating without the censorship or logical coherence imposed by the waking intellect. They are the will's raw, unfiltered monologue. Schopenhauer saw dreams as a kind of spontaneous philosophical activity, revealing the underlying nature of human desire and suffering in a symbolic form. The study of dreams, he believed, could offer insights into the unconscious workings of the will that are often obscured in waking life. This proto-Freudian insight into the symbolic and revelatory nature of dreams further highlights his anticipatory contributions to depth psychology. The human memory, too, is seen as serving the will. We tend to remember what is relevant to our desires and forget what is not. Memory is not a perfect recording device, but a selective instrument, filtering and preserving information based on its utility to the will. This explains why we often vividly recall past slights or unfulfilled desires, while less emotionally charged information may fade more quickly. Even our perception of time and our engagement with history are colored by the will. History, for Schopenhauer, is largely a chronicle of the will's endless, meaningless struggles and repetitions, rather than a narrative of progress towards some grand end. Since the will is constant and unchangeable in its essence, human nature, and therefore the fundamental dynamics of history, remain perpetually the same. Different eras merely provide new costumes and stages for the same eternal drama of desire, conflict, and suffering. True philosophical insight, therefore, comes not from studying the endless details of historical events, but from recognizing the underlying, unchanging nature of the will that manifests through them. Only in art and philosophy, which deal with the timeless Platonic ideas, can one find a respite from the dreary repetition of historical particulars. This historical pessimism contrasts sharply with the Hegelian emphasis on historical progress and the unfolding of spirit. For Schopenhauer, history offers no redemption or ultimate meaning. It is merely the will's constant, futile churning. The only escape is to transcend its relentless flow through denial. Ultimately, Schopenhauer's analysis of human psychology paints a picture of beings fundamentally driven by forces beyond their conscious control. The intellect, while capable of moments of detachment and profound insight, remains largely a servant to the blind, striving will. Our emotions, dreams, memories, and even our understanding of history are all shaped by this pervasive, irrational force. This perspective encourages a deep introspection, a questioning of our own motivations, and a recognition of the pervasive influence of unconscious drives. It invites us to acknowledge the inherent suffering of existence, not to wallow in it, but as a necessary step towards the possibility of liberation through denial of the very will that defines our being. For Schopenhauer, true self-knowledge involves recognizing the will's tyranny and seeking to overcome it, rather than merely submitting to its dictates. His psychological insights, particularly those regarding the unconscious, predated much of modern psychology and continue to resonate with those who seek a deeper understanding of the non-rational forces that shape the human mind and direct our lives. The very act of analyzing these aspects of human experience is, in a way, an attempt by the intellect to gain leverage over the will, to understand its mechanisms in order to disarm its power. Schopenhauer's philosophy also contains a distinct perspective on the relationship between humans and animals, a view that arises directly from his central concept of the will. For him, the universal will manifests itself throughout all of nature, animating not just humans, but also animals, plants, and even inorganic forces. This means that animals are not fundamentally different from humans in their essential nature. They too are objectifications of the same blind, striving will. The difference lies primarily in the grade of objectification and the complexity of their intellects. Animals, possessing simpler intellects, are driven by their will more directly and instinctively. They experience suffering, fear, and pleasure, just as humans do, albeit perhaps with less complex cognitive overlay. Their lives are characterized by the same fundamental struggle for existence, the same insatiable desires for survival and procreation that afflict humanity. This shared foundation of the will leads Schopenhauer to a remarkable degree of empathy for animals, a position that was quite progressive for his time. He argued passionately against cruelty to animals, seeing it as a direct manifestation of a depraved and unfeeling human will. To inflict unnecessary suffering upon an animal is to deny the essential unity of the will that animates both the human and the animal. It reveals a lack of mitleid or compassion, which he held as the basis of all morality. Cruelty to animals, in his view, is a sign of a bad character, of a will that is excessively affirmed and lacks insight into the universal suffering inherent in all living beings. This compassion for animals contrasts sharply with many philosophical traditions that place humans in a unique moral category, often arguing that animals lack reason or a soul, and therefore fall outside the scope of ethical concern. Schopenhauer's monistic metaphysics, where everything is ultimately a manifestation of the single will, dissolves this sharp distinction, emphasizing the shared suffering and the underlying identity between all forms of life. He would have readily embraced modern animal rights movements, grounding them not in utility or abstract rights, but in a profound recognition of shared sentience and suffering stemming from the universal will. Furthermore, his philosophy views the natural world in its entirety as a vast stage upon which the will plays out its eternal tragic drama. The struggle for existence in the animal kingdom, the predator-prey relationship, the ceaseless striving of plants for light and nutrients, all these phenomena are direct expressions of the will to live at various grades of objectification. Nature is not a benevolent force, but a relentless, indifferent manifestation of the blind urge to exist, to consume, and to perpetuate. This perspective offers a profound, if bleak, ecological insight. The natural world is not designed for human comfort or purpose, but is a self-sustaining cycle of striving and consumption, driven by an unconscious cosmic force. Humans are merely a part of this cycle, albeit a particularly self-aware and therefore particularly suffering part. The beauty of nature, like the beauty of art, offers a temporary aesthetic escape, allowing the intellect to contemplate the Platonic ideas manifested in natural forms, thus providing a brief respite from the individual will's concerns. However, the underlying reality of nature remains the relentless, suffering will. The concept of death, already discussed as the dissolution of individual objectification while the will persists, applies equally to animals. When an animal dies, its particular manifestation of the will ceases, but the universal will to live continues its ceaseless activity, manifesting in new forms. This offers a kind of immortality not for the individual creature, but for the underlying life force itself. Schopenhauer also touches upon the relationship between the physical world and the will's manifestations. Physics, chemistry, and biology, for him, are sciences that study the different grades of the will's objectification. Gravity, electromagnetism, and chemical affinities are all lower-grade manifestations of the will, striving to express themselves in certain ways. They are the will operating blindly and unconsciously at fundamental levels. The plant kingdom represents a higher grade, where the will manifests as an urge for growth and reproduction, while the animal kingdom shows the will expressing itself through conscious striving and locomotion. This hierarchical view of nature, where increasingly complex phenomena are seen as higher objectifications of the same underlying will, provides a unified, if somewhat reductionist, framework for understanding the entire cosmos. It collapses the traditional distinctions between mind and matter, spirit and nature, by positing a single underlying metaphysical principle that animates everything. In this grand scheme, human beings, with their complex intellects and capacity for self-awareness, are a particularly intense and suffering expression of the will. This self-awareness, while leading to greater suffering, also offers the unique possibility of recognizing the will's nature and potentially denying it. Animals, lacking this advanced intellect, are spared the profound existential anguish of humanity, but they are also denied the path to conscious liberation. They remain forever bound to the will's dictates, capable of transcending its endless striving. Thus, Schopenhauer's philosophy presents a comprehensive worldview, where the entire universe, from the smallest atom to the most complex human mind, is a manifestation of the single, restless, irrational will. This perspective fosters a profound sense of interconnectedness among all living things and grounds a powerful ethical imperative towards compassion for all sentient beings, stemming from the shared bond of suffering under the dominion of the universal will. It compels us to see ourselves not as separate from nature, but as an integral, albeit uniquely tormented part of its grand, tragic unfolding. The aesthetic theory of Schopenhauer, particularly his emphasis on music, deserves a deeper exploration, as it forms a crucial counterpoint to the relentless pessimism of his metaphysics. While life is suffering and the world is a manifestation of blind will, art, and especially music, offers a unique and profound avenue for temporary liberation. As discussed for Schopenhauer, most art forms, painting, sculpture, poetry, drama, represent the Platonic ideas, which are the eternal, unchanging archetypes or universal forms that constitute the various grades of the will's objectification. When we behold a beautiful landscape painting, for example, we are not primarily appreciating the specific trees or mountains, but the universal idea of landscape or vegetation that the particular work successfully embodies. In this act of contemplation, the viewer's individual intellect temporarily transcends its usual subservience to the will and becomes a pure, will-less subject of knowing. This means that for a fleeting moment, our personal desires, anxieties, and the egoistic striving that usually defines our existence are suspended. We are absorbed entirely in the objective contemplation of the idea, finding a profound sense of peace and detachment from the suffering world. This is the source of aesthetic pleasure, not gratification of personal desire, but liberation from it. This state of pure contemplation is rare and precious, a glimpse of serenity amidst the turmoil of the will. Yet music stands apart. Schopenhauer declared music to be the metaphysics of the world, arguing that it is fundamentally different from other arts. While other arts are objectifications of the will at some grade, i.e., they represent Platonic ideas, music, he believed, is a direct objectification of the will itself, prior to its objectification in the world of ideas or phenomena. It expresses the inner essence of the world, not through images or concepts, but through the universal language of tones, rhythms, and harmonies. Music, therefore, does not represent the world of phenomena or its underlying ideas, but rather represents the inner nature of the will directly. It manifests the constant ebb and flow of desire, the tension and resolution, the longing and satisfaction, the joy and sorrow that constitute the very essence of the will's striving. The bass notes represent the will's deepest, most fundamental urges, while the melodies and higher notes symbolize its more differentiated manifestations and fleeting desires. The harmonies and dissonances reflect the conflicts and resolutions within the will itself. Because music bypasses the intellect's reliance on concepts and representations, it can penetrate directly to the core of our being, eliciting the deepest emotional responses. It affects us more profoundly and universally than any other art form because it speaks the language of the will itself, which is common to all beings. Listening to a powerful piece of music, one feels a direct connection to the fundamental forces of existence, experiencing a sense of unity with the universal will and a temporary cessation of individual suffering. In this musical absorption, the listener transcends their individuality and merges with the universal current of the will, feeling its movements directly, without the mediation of the painful individual striving. This direct access to the will makes music the most powerful and significant of all arts for Schopenhauer, and is a revelation of the world's inner nature, a kind of unconscious philosophy that everyone understands instinctively. This explains why music can evoke such intense emotions, even without a clear conceptual understanding of what is being expressed. It directly resonates with the will within us. This profound elevation of music places Schopenhauer as a significant figure in the philosophy of music, particularly influencing composers like Richard Wagner, who found in Schopenhauer's theories a philosophical justification for his own revolutionary ideas about opera as a Gesamtkunstwerk, total work of art that directly expresses fundamental human passions. The unique power of music for Schopenhauer lies in its capacity to offer a profound, though temporary, liberation from the individual will. It doesn't offer a permanent solution to suffering, but it provides a sacred space where the intellect can be released from its practical duties and contemplate the pure, unadulterated essence of reality, the will itself, in a way that brings solace and a temporary sense of transcendence. It is a moment of pure, disinterested knowing, untainted by the subjective desires and anxieties of the individual. Thus, while the world is a representation, and that representation is animated by a ceaseless, suffering will, art and music in particular, offers a vital escape hatch. It is a temporary suspension of the suffering inherent in existence, a moment of profound peace and insight where the intellect, finally free, can simply perceive the raw truth of the will without being enslaved by it. This aesthetic dimension is crucial for understanding the nuances of Schopenhauer's thought. It is the silver lining in his otherwise dark philosophical clouds, providing a necessary counterweight to his relentless pessimism and offering humanity a means, however temporary, to rise above the tragic inevitability of its own nature. It demonstrates that even within a world defined by suffering, there are moments of profound beauty and transcendence available to those who cultivate the capacity for pure, disinterested contemplation. Schopenhauer's concept of the will, while universal and singular, manifests in a hierarchical structure of objectification, allowing him to explain the diverse phenomena of the natural world. This hierarchy begins with the lowest, most unconscious manifestations and ascends to the highest and most complex. At the lowest grades of objectification, the will appears as the fundamental forces of nature: gravity, cohesion, rigidity, fluidity, elasticity, and chemical properties. These are not merely inert laws, but the will striving blindly and universally. A stone falling, a magnet attracting iron, a gas expanding. These are all expressions of the will to exist, its most rudimentary and unreflective self-assertion. They lack consciousness and individual desire, yet they are driven by the same underlying force that animates all life. Moving up the hierarchy, the will objectifies itself in the plant kingdom. Here, the will appears as the force of life, growth, and reproduction. Plants exhibit a ceaseless striving for light, nutrients, and the perpetuation of their species. They display a basic form of purposefulness, albeit an unconscious one, in their development and adaptation. While lacking a nervous system or individual consciousness, their entire being is dedicated to affirming the will to live. Above plants, the will manifests in the animal kingdom. Animals possess a nervous system and, consequently, consciousness, albeit one primarily confined to immediate perception and instinctual drives. Their will to live expresses itself through locomotion, sensation, and a more complex range of desires, such as hunger, thirst, fear, and the sexual impulse. They engage in a continuous struggle for survival, feeding on each other, constantly driven by the will's imperative to exist and reproduce. Their suffering is more acute than that of plants, as they possess a rudimentary intellect capable of experiencing pain and anticipating danger, but they lack the capacity for abstract thought or the profound self-awareness that distinguishes humanity. The pinnacle of the will's objectification is found in human beings. In humans, the will develops the most complex organ for its purposes, the brain, which gives rise to intellect and reason. The human intellect, with its capacity for abstract thought, language, and self-reflection, represents the highest grade of the will's manifestation. This advanced intellect allows humans to navigate the world with greater sophistication, to plan, to remember, and to anticipate. However, this very capacity for advanced consciousness also brings with it a profound increase in suffering. Unlike animals, humans are not merely confined to the present moment. They can remember past pains and anticipate future anxieties, creating a constant state of discontent. The human intellect, while a marvel, also makes humans uniquely aware of the futility of their striving and the inevitability of death. This awareness leads to existential anguish, a form of suffering far deeper than mere physical pain or immediate frustration of desire. It is the will's tragic self-awareness. Furthermore, within human society, there are different expressions of the will, particularly evident in the distinction between the man of willing and the man of knowing. The vast majority of humanity comprises the man of willing, individuals whose intellect remains firmly in the service of their individual will. Their lives are characterized by constant striving for material possessions, social status, pleasure, and the avoidance of pain. They are largely unaware of the deeper metaphysical realities, living within the veil of Maya and driven by the endless cycle of desire. Their actions are motivated by egoism, and their happiness is fleeting, constantly threatened by boredom and renewed desires. In contrast, the man of knowing is the rare individual, the genius, the philosopher, the ascetic, whose intellect has, to some degree, liberated itself from the complete servitude of the individual will. This liberation allows them to engage in pure, disinterested contemplation, to perceive the Platonic ideas as an aesthetic experience, or even, ultimately, to deny the will itself. This detachment from the individual will leads to a profound sense of peace and a deeper understanding of the world's true nature. These individuals are capable of genuine compassion because they see through the illusion of individuation and recognize the underlying unity of the will in all beings. They are the ones who can potentially transcend the suffering inherent in existence. This hierarchy of objectification reinforces Schopenhauer's deterministic view of nature. Each grade of objectification behaves according to the inherent laws of the will at that level. A stone must fall, a plant must grow towards light, an animal must seek food and reproduce, and humans, for the most part, must follow their character and the dictates of their will, unless they achieve the profound insight and strength of will to deny it. The entire universe, then, is a grand unfolding of this single, irrational, and eternally striving will, a cosmic drama of becoming and perishing, driven by a blind force that knows no ultimate purpose beyond its own ceaseless affirmation. This hierarchical view provides a coherent, if bleak, explanation for the diversity of phenomena in the world, unified under the single, all-encompassing principle of the will. It underlines the interconnectedness of all things, from the inert matter to conscious beings, all bound by the same fundamental essence. Schopenhauer's philosophy of language and communication, though not as systematically developed as other parts of his system, flows naturally from his understanding of the intellect's subservient role to the will and the nature of representation. He saw language primarily as a tool for the intellect to serve the will, allowing for more complex coordination of actions, the transmission of knowledge for practical purposes, and the manipulation of others. Words are mere signs, abstract concepts that allow us to organize and categorize the world of representation, but they are always a step removed from the immediate intuitive understanding of the will. The intellect forms concepts through abstraction from particulars, and these concepts are then labeled with words. This process is crucial for rational thought and communication, allowing us to generalize and to share information. However, Schopenhauer was deeply suspicious of the limitations and potential for misuse of language, particularly in philosophy. He argued that abstract concepts, while necessary for thinking, can easily become empty or misleading if they lose their connection to direct intuition or experience. He criticized philosophers who spun elaborate systems out of abstract concepts without grounding them in concrete reality or introspection, a clear jab at his German idealist contemporaries. For him, such philosophy was mere wordplay, devoid of genuine insight. True philosophical understanding, he believed, arises from a direct, intuitive grasp of reality, the will, and only then can language be used to articulate these insights, always recognizing its inherent limitations. Language is a veil, a form of representation that, like all representations, obscures the raw reality of the will. While useful, it can never fully capture the immediate, ineffable experience of the will itself or the pure contemplation of Platonic ideas. This is why music, for instance, transcends language. It speaks directly to the will without the mediation of words or concepts. The very act of communication, therefore, involves an inherent challenge. We attempt to convey our representations and insights through words, which are abstract and general, while the underlying reality, the will, and the individual experiences of it are immediate and unique. This can lead to misunderstandings, where one person's concept, though using the same word, may not perfectly align with another's. Furthermore, the egoistic nature of the will often uses language for deceptive purposes. People employ words to persuade, manipulate, flatter, or conceal their true motives, which are always rooted in their self-serving will. Rhetoric and sophistry are examples of language being used to serve the individual will's agenda, rather than to genuinely seek or convey truth. He was deeply critical of verbose and unclear writing, viewing it as a sign of intellectual dishonesty or muddled thinking, possibly driven by a will to impress rather than enlighten. He advocated for clear, precise, and concise language, believing that complex ideas could and should be expressed simply if truly understood. This commitment to clarity stemmed from his conviction that philosophy's purpose was to reveal truth, not to obscure it. The act of reading and writing, for Schopenhauer, was also seen through the lens of the will. Many people read merely to pass the time or to gather superficial information, allowing their intellect to be passively entertained rather than actively engaged in profound thought. True reading, for him, involves a deep engagement with the author's ideas, a willingness to challenge one's own assumptions, and a contemplative effort to grasp the underlying truths. Similarly, writing, if it is to be worthwhile, must stem from genuine insight and a desire to communicate truth, not from vanity or a desire for recognition. His criticisms of academic writing and publishing are often directed at those who write for professional advancement rather than for the sake of knowledge itself, accusing them of being driven by their will for status rather than the intellect's pursuit of truth. His own literary style, marked by its directness and sharp wit, reflects his views on language. It should be a transparent vehicle for thought, not an opaque barrier. He frequently used powerful metaphors and analogies to make his abstract metaphysical concepts more accessible and intuitive, recognizing that language, while limited, could be wielded artfully to illuminate profound truths. In sum, Schopenhauer viewed language as an essential but ultimately flawed tool of the intellect, always in service of the underlying will. While it allows for communication and abstract thought, it can also obscure truth and facilitate deception. Its highest use is in conveying profound philosophical insights that arise from direct intuition of the will, but even then, it can only approximate the ineffable reality it seeks to describe. His skepticism about language's ultimate capacity to convey truth fully positions him, paradoxically, as a meticulous stylist who believed that only through precise and unadorned language could one even attempt to speak about the unspeakable nature of the will. It is a tool for the knowing subject to navigate the world of representation, but it can never fully grasp the thing in itself. This understanding underscores his belief that true wisdom transcends mere words and conceptual frameworks, pointing towards a deeper, intuitive grasp of existence. Schopenhauer's philosophy, while predominantly metaphysical, also contains significant epistemological insights, particularly concerning the limits of human knowledge and the nature of truth. His epistemology is fundamentally Kantian in its starting point, asserting that knowledge is always conditioned by the subjective forms of our intellect, space, time, and causality. The world we perceive, the representation, is not an objective reality as it exists independently, but rather reality as it appears to us, structured by these innate cognitive categories. There is no unmediated access to the external world. Our intellect processes raw sensory data through these forms, creating the coherent, orderly world of objects and events that we experience. This means that all empirical knowledge is confined to the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. Science, therefore, can only ever describe the laws and relations within the representation, exploring how phenomena interact according to the principle of sufficient reason, causality, logical ground, mathematical relations, and motivation. It can explain how things happen, but not why they exist or what their ultimate inner nature is. For example, physics describes the laws of gravity, but it cannot explain the essence of the force itself. Chemistry describes reactions, but not the ultimate will behind elemental attractions. This is where metaphysics, in Schopenhauer's view, steps in. While the intellect, operating according to the principle of sufficient reason, can only know the world as representation, Schopenhauer claims we have a unique kind of knowledge of the thing in itself, the will. This knowledge is not conceptual or intellectual in the ordinary sense, but rather a direct, immediate, and intuitive awareness. We know our own body both as an object in space and time representation and as the direct manifestation of our own volition's will. This dual aspect of the body provides the key, through analogy, to understanding the inner essence of all phenomena. This is a crucial epistemological claim that distinguishes him sharply from Kant. For Schopenhauer, true philosophical knowledge or metaphysical insight involves transcending the limitations of the intellect's ordinary operations. It requires a profound act of introspection and a recognition that the same striving, irrational will that we experience within ourselves is the underlying reality of the entire cosmos. This insight is not achieved through logical deduction alone, but through an intuitive leap, an overcoming of the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, which makes us see ourselves as separate from others. The concept of truth itself is reinterpreted in Schopenhauer's system. He distinguishes between different kinds of truth. Empirical truth relates to the accurate correspondence of our representations with external objects in the phenomenal world as governed by the principle of sufficient reason. Logical truth relates to the consistency of our concepts and propositions. But ultimately, for Schopenhauer, a deeper metaphysical truth resides in the understanding of the will as the ultimate reality. This higher truth is not merely about facts or logical consistency, but about grasping the fundamental nature of existence. This kind of truth often eludes the ordinary intellect, which is too entangled in the service of the individual will and its practical concerns. It is the truth revealed in moments of aesthetic contemplation or in the profound realization that leads to the denial of the will. Skepticism, in Schopenhauer's view, can be a valuable starting point, as it challenges naive realism and forces us to recognize the subjective nature of our knowledge. However, he rejects absolute skepticism, arguing that while the external world is representation, it is not arbitrary. It is a coherent, law-governed manifestation of the will. The very fact that our forms of intuition, space, time, causality allow us to organize and understand the world, even if only as appearance, demonstrates a deep connection between the knowing subject and the object. Moreover, Schopenhauer's epistemology influences his critique of reason. While reason is the highest faculty of the intellect, it is still a servant of the will. Its primary function is to form abstract concepts and to apply the principle of sufficient reason in its various forms. It is excellent for navigating the phenomenal world and for practical purposes, but it is ultimately limited. Reason cannot grasp the will directly, nor can it provide ultimate meaning or purpose to existence, because the will itself is irrational and purposeless. This limitation of reason makes genuine philosophical insight rare and arduous. It is not achieved by simply piling up logical arguments, but by a deeper, intuitive grasp of reality that transcends mere conceptual thinking. The true philosopher must be able to see through the veil of Maya to the underlying will. This requires a certain intellectual courage and detachment from the egoistic demands of the individual will. The epistemological challenge for Schopenhauer, then, is to move beyond the superficial knowledge of appearances and penetrate to the core of reality. This journey is facilitated by introspection, aesthetic experience, and ultimately by a profound shift in one's perspective that recognizes the universal, suffering will. The highest knowledge is not about accumulating more facts, but about achieving a fundamental insight, an insight into the nature of existence, an insight that leads not to more striving, but to quietude and the possibility of liberation through the denial of the will. His epistemology, therefore, is not merely about how we know, but about what we can ultimately know, and what implications that knowledge has for living a meaningful life in a world that, by its very nature, is permeated by suffering. It is an epistemology that points beyond itself towards a soteriological end. Schopenhauer's system, while seemingly bleak, carries a unique form of spiritual or quasi-religious dimension, especially in its emphasis on liberation through the denial of the will. While he was an atheist and rejected organized religion, particularly the Judeo-Christian tradition's concept of a benevolent personal God, he found profound resonance with the mystical and ascetic traditions of Eastern philosophies, primarily Buddhism and Hinduism, specifically the Upanishads. He saw in these ancient wisdom traditions a profound corroboration of his own insights into the nature of suffering, the illusory nature of the phenomenal world, and the path to liberation. He believed that these religions, stripped of their mythological or dogmatic accretions, intuitively grasped the same metaphysical truths that he had arrived at through philosophical reasoning and introspection. The Buddhist concept of dukkha suffering as inherent to existence, the idea of anatta, no self, which aligns with the dissolution of the principium individuationis, and the goal of nirvana, the cessation of craving and suffering, all found their parallels in Schopenhauer's philosophy of the will and its denial. Similarly, from the Upanishads, he adopted the notion of Maya as the veil of illusion that obscures the true nature of reality, the will, and the idea of moksha liberation from the cycle of rebirth, samsara, which he interpreted metaphorically as liberation from the endless affirmation of the will. For Schopenhauer, true spiritual insight is not about worshiping a deity or adhering to rituals, but about a radical transformation of consciousness achieved through self-knowledge and ethical action. The path to this spiritual liberation is the ascetic one, a conscious turning away from all desires, pleasures, and attachments to the phenomenal world. This involves voluntary poverty, chastity, fasting, and a general detachment from worldly concerns. The saint or ascetic, through extreme self-discipline, gradually weakens the grip of the will upon their individual manifestation. This isn't merely a moral choice, but a metaphysical one, leading to a state of profound peace, quietude, and freedom from suffering. This state, which he often equated with nirvana, is not annihilation in the sense of ceasing to exist, but the cessation of the will's striving. It is a state where the individual will no longer affirms itself, and thus the suffering associated with its ceaseless craving also ceases. From the perspective of the affirmed will, this state appears as nothingness, a terrifying void. But from the perspective of the liberated individual, it is the highest form of positive peace and ultimate freedom, a state beyond the reach of the world's pain. It is a transcendence of the very conditions of existence. He argued that truly religious insights, at their deepest level, are about this denial of the will. Even Christianity, he believed, contained elements of this asceticism and the recognition of suffering, e.g., the emphasis on self-sacrifice, charity, the renunciation of worldly pleasures, and the concept of original sin as the affirmation of the will to live. He saw the suffering of Christ and the concept of redemption not through a traditional theological lens, but as symbolic representations of the universal suffering and the possibility of liberation through the denial of the will. His philosophy also implicitly suggests a form of cosmic justice, not in the sense of divine retribution or reward, but in the inherent nature of suffering itself. Since the will is singular and manifests in all beings, every act of affirmation, every indulgence in desire, inevitably perpetuates suffering, both for oneself and for others. Conversely, every act of compassion and denial of the will alleviates suffering, leading towards liberation. The afterlife in Schopenhauer's system is not a personal heaven or hell, but the continued existence of the will itself. While the individual consciousness dissolves at death, the underlying will, being outside of space and time, remains eternal, manifesting in new forms. This offers a peculiar comfort to the suffering individual, as their specific torment ceases, but it implies that the universal suffering of the will continues. This non-traditional spiritual path is profoundly individualistic. It is not about communal worship or dogmatic adherence, but about an intensely personal journey of self-overcoming. The insight into the will and the subsequent denial must come from within, through deep reflection and sustained effort. It is a path for the rare few who are capable of seeing through the illusions of existence and willing to undertake the arduous task of liberating themselves from the tyranny of their own desires. Schopenhauer's system, therefore, provides a philosophical full framework for understanding human suffering and offers a radical, non-theistic path to redemption. It transforms the world, which is a place of endless torment for the affirmed will, into a stage for liberation for those who understand and deny it. This makes his philosophy, for all its bleakness, a profound guide for those seeking spiritual solace outside the confines of traditional religious belief, offering a unique blend of Western philosophical rigor and Eastern mystical insight. Schopenhauer's concept of the character and its relation to freedom is a subtle yet crucial aspect of his philosophy, serving as a bridge between his metaphysics of the will and his views on human action and moral responsibility. For Schopenhauer, every individual possesses an intelligible character and an empirical character. The intelligible character is the individual's specific, unique manifestation of the universal will. It is not something acquired or learned, but is given, unchangeable, and lies outside of time and causality, analogous to Plato's eternal forms. It is the unalterable essence of who one truly is, the fundamental direction of one's will. This intelligible character determines the basic predisposition, inclinations, and motivations that an individual possesses. From this fundamental metaphysical character, the empirical character is derived. The empirical character is the intelligible character as it unfolds and expresses itself in the world of phenomena within the constraints of space, time, and causality. It is what we observe in a person's consistent patterns of behavior, their reactions to different circumstances, their virtues and vices. While we might observe changes in a person's habits or opinions, their fundamental empirical character, which is the phenomenal manifestation of their intelligible character, remains constant throughout life. A person's actions, therefore, are not a result of free choice in the conventional sense. Schopenhauer was a determinist when it came to individual actions within the phenomenal world. He argued that every action is the necessary outcome of a given motive acting upon a given, unchangeable character. We are free to do what we will, but we are not free to will what we will. Our will, as an individual manifestation of the universal will, is determined by our intelligible character. When a motive, an external circumstance, a thought, or a feeling is presented to an individual, their character reacts to it in a predetermined way, leading to a specific action. The feeling of freedom we experience when making a choice is merely the consciousness of being able to do what we desire, not the consciousness of being able to desire otherwise. We perceive our actions as free because we are only aware of the action itself, not the intricate interplay of motive and character that necessarily leads to it. If we fully understood a person's character and the precise motives acting upon them, we could predict their actions with certainty. This determinism, however, does not negate moral responsibility for Schopenhauer. Instead, responsibility is shifted from the individual action to the character itself. We are responsible for who we are, for the fundamental nature of our will as manifested in our intelligible character from which all our actions flow. Our actions are merely the empirical expression of our inner essence. A bad person performs bad actions because their character is bad, and it is for this underlying character that they are morally accountable. The possibility of true freedom, therefore, lies not in the realm of empirical actions, but in a metaphysical domain, the freedom from the will. This is the freedom achieved through the denial of the will to live. This is not a choice within the determined chain of actions, but a fundamental, transcendental shift in one's entire being. It is an act of liberation from the very nature of the intelligible character, an overcoming of the affirmation of the will that constitutes one's essence. This denial is a rare event, brought about by profound insight into the suffering inherent in the will's affirmation and the recognition of the underlying unity of all existence compassion. When an individual performs an act of selfless benevolence or embarks on an ascetic path, it is not a random deviation from their character, but the empirical manifestation of a fundamental shift that has occurred at the level of their intelligible character, a turning away from the will's affirmation. This ultimate freedom is a freedom from necessity, a freedom that transcends causality and the forms of the intellect. It is a liberation from the cycle of suffering that the will perpetuates. It is the individual will realizing its own suffering and the suffering of the universal will, consciously deciding to negate its striving. This is the only true freedom Schopenhauer envisions, a freedom that leads to the ultimate peace of nirvana. It's a freedom that is not about choosing between good and evil actions, but about transcending the very framework of good and evil by denying the will that creates both. This metaphysical freedom, therefore, is not a license for arbitrary action, but a radical transformation of one's being, a profound act of self-overcoming that is truly unique in its ability to break the chains of determination. The path to this freedom is arduous and rare, requiring a deep, intuitive understanding of the will's nature and the courage to renounce its demands. Thus, while our daily actions are determined by our character and motives, Schopenhauer offers a glimmer of a higher transcendental freedom, the freedom to deny the very force that defines our existence and thereby escape the cycle of suffering. This profound concept of freedom is one of the most distinctive and challenging aspects of his entire philosophical system. Schopenhauer's insights into the nature of suffering and its pervasive presence in existence form the bedrock of his entire philosophy. His core assertion is that suffering is not an accidental feature of life, but is inherent in the very nature of the will. Because the will is a blind, ceaseless, irrational striving, it is by its very essence characterized by a lack and incompleteness, a desire that is never fully and permanently satisfied. To will is to desire, and to desire is to suffer from not having. Even when a particular desire is fulfilled, satisfaction is fleeting. A new desire immediately arises, or boredom, a different form of suffering, sets in. This continuous oscillation between desire pain and boredom emptiness constitutes the fundamental pattern of all existence. Life, in this view, is a constant struggle, a perpetual overcoming of obstacles, only to be confronted by new ones. Every organism, from the simplest plant to the most complex human, is engaged in a relentless effort to survive, to reproduce, to consume, and to avoid being consumed. This will to live drives a fierce competition, a war of all against all, bellum omnium contra omnes, where life feeds on life. The world, therefore, is depicted as a hell, where suffering is the common currency, and every individual is a patient enduring a particular affliction. The more developed the intellect, the more intensely suffering is experienced. Humans, with their capacity for abstract thought, memory, and anticipation, suffer more profoundly than animals. We are not merely bound to the present moment, but can remember past pains and anticipate future anxieties, creating a continuous state of mental anguish. The intellect, which might seem like a blessing, is in this sense a curse, as it amplifies the basic suffering inherent in the will. It makes us acutely aware of the futility of our striving, the transience of pleasure, and the inevitability of death. This is why human life, despite moments of joy, is ultimately characterized by profound dissatisfaction and a sense of meaninglessness. Schopenhauer famously argued that this is the worst of all possible worlds, not in a crude empirical sense, but metaphysically. If the world were even slightly better, if suffering were significantly diminished, the immense power of the will in its insatiable striving would quickly push it back into a state of misery and conflict. The very existence of a world driven by an irrational will necessitates suffering. Suffering is the engine of existence. Without it, the will would cease to strive, and the world would dissolve into nothingness. The apparent moments of happiness or pleasure are merely the temporary cessation of pain, the brief relief from the pressure of desire, and not a positive good in themselves. They are like a brief moment of quiet after a painful scream, only for the scream to resume. This pessimistic assessment extends to all aspects of human life. Love, as discussed, is a trick of the will for procreation, leading to disillusionment. Ambition and success offer only fleeting satisfaction. Even our greatest achievements are ultimately swallowed by time and death, rendering them meaningless in the grand scheme. The brevity of life, coupled with its constant struggle, emphasizes its inherent tragedy. Given this pervasive suffering, Schopenhauer posits that the denial of the will to live is the only true path to liberation and peace. This is not about seeking pleasure or avoiding pain within the world, but about consciously turning away from the very impulse to affirm existence. It is the recognition that the root cause of all suffering is the will itself, and therefore true salvation lies in weakening its grip. This path of asceticism and renunciation offers a radical escape from the cycle of desire and suffering. By systematically extinguishing desires, by embracing detachment, the individual can achieve a state of profound inner quietude, a nirvana, where the ceaseless torment of the will is finally stilled. This state is not a personal annihilation, but a cessation of willing, a freedom from the suffering that willing entails. For Schopenhauer, understanding the universality of suffering is the first step towards wisdom. It breeds compassion, Mitleid, as one recognizes that the suffering of others is fundamentally one's own, since all individuals are manifestations of the same will. This shared bond of suffering provides the ethical imperative for benevolence and justice. Ultimately, Schopenhauer's philosophy presents suffering not as a problem to be solved within the world, but as an inherent condition of existence to be transcended. It is a philosophy that demands an unflinching gaze at the darkest aspects of reality. arguing that only by fully confronting the pervasive nature of suffering can humanity hope to find a true, albeit radical, path to peace and liberation from the endless cycle of the will. His insights on suffering continue to resonate with those who feel the weight of existential angst and find traditional sources of comfort inadequate. Schopenhauer's concept of death is intrinsically linked to his understanding of the will, providing a unique perspective that offers a peculiar form of solace, though not in the conventional sense of personal immortality. For Schopenhauer, individual death is the cessation of a particular representation of the will, the dissolution of a specific empirical objectification. The body, as an object in space and time, perishes, and the individual consciousness tied to that body and its brain ceases to exist. There is no personal afterlife in the traditional sense, no individual soul that persists in a heaven or hell. However, the will itself is immortal and eternal. As the thing in itself, it exists outside of time and space, unaffected by the temporal processes of birth and death. When an individual dies, their particular manifestation of the will simply dissolves back into the universal, undivided will, only to objectify itself anew in countless other forms. Death, therefore, is not an absolute end, but a transformation, a continuous recycling of the fundamental life force. It is merely the will pulling back its particular manifestation, like an artist completing one painting and moving on to another. The will, in its essence, is imperishable. This metaphysical persistence of the will means that while your individual consciousness ends, the underlying force that animated you continues to strive, to suffer, and to manifest in new beings. This offers a strange kind of comfort. The specific torment of an individual being ceases. The particular configuration of suffering that was you is gone, but it also carries a grim implication. The suffering of the universal will continues unabated in new forms. Schopenhauer famously compared death to the setting sun, which appears to disappear but merely shines on other parts of the world, or to a dream from which one awakens, not into another dream, but into the underlying reality of the will. The fear of death, for Schopenhauer, stems primarily from the will's desperate affirmation of itself, its inherent fear of annihilation. The will to live clings to existence at all costs, and death represents its ultimate defeat for the individual. However, from the perspective of the intellect that has gained insight into the nature of the will, this fear can be mitigated. If one understands that one's true essence is the will, which is eternal, and that individuality is merely a temporary phenomenon, the principium individuationis, then death loses some of its terror. What truly matters is the persistence of the will, not the fleeting empirical manifestation. Moreover, Schopenhauer argued against suicide, viewing it not as a denial of the will, but as a strong affirmation of it. The person who commits suicide desires a different, better life, but is merely dissatisfied with the conditions of their current existence. They still want to live, just not this life. Suicide, therefore, is not a liberation from the will, but a continuation of its striving, albeit in a destructive form. The true denial of the will, the path to liberation, involves a conscious and sustained turning away from all desires, including the desire for a different life. This means accepting suffering without complaint and gradually extinguishing the very impulse to affirm existence. This is a far more arduous and profound path than suicide. The contemplation of death is, for Schopenhauer, an essential philosophical exercise. It forces us to confront the transience of life, the futility of worldly striving, and the illusory nature of personal significance. This confrontation can be a powerful impetus for turning away from the will's demands and seeking the higher path of its denial. It helps to dissolve the attachment to the ego and its desires, recognizing that all individual life is merely a temporary, suffering manifestation of the universal will. In this sense, death, or at least the contemplation of it, serves as a catalyst for philosophical insight and potentially for the denial of the will. It brings into sharp focus the ultimate meaninglessness of worldly pursuits and the inherent suffering that underlies all affirmation of existence. For the individual who has achieved the denial of the will, death is no longer a terrifying end, but the ultimate liberation from the cycle of suffering. It is the final dissolution of the particular representation, allowing the underlying suffering will to cease its individual manifestation. From the perspective of nirvana, death is the ultimate release, the final embrace of the nothingness that is, paradoxically, the truest form of peace. Thus, Schopenhauer's philosophy of death is not one of despair, but of radical realism, offering a unique form of solace through understanding. It posits that while the individual perishes, the essential life force continues. More importantly, it highlights death as the ultimate prompt for philosophical wisdom, urging us to look beyond the transient world of appearances and to find liberation from the will's endless striving. Schopenhauer's concept of nihilism, though he didn't use the term in the modern sense it was popularized by Nietzsche, is implicitly present in his philosophy and represents a profound consequence of his worldview. If the ultimate reality, the will, is a blind, irrational, purposeless striving, then life, which is merely an objectification of this will, lacks any inherent meaning or teleological goal. There is no divine plan, no ultimate good to be achieved, no progress towards a higher state. Existence is simply a ceaseless, cyclical process of desire, suffering, and temporary gratification, leading ultimately to boredom and renewed desire. This fundamental lack of objective purpose or value in the universe can be interpreted as a form of metaphysical nihilism. The world is not good or bad in itself, but simply is, driven by a force that is beyond moral judgment and ultimately indifferent to human concerns. Our values, purposes, and moral frameworks are human constructs, attempts by the intellect to impose order and meaning on a chaotic and meaningless reality, or to serve the will's own pragmatic ends. The suffering inherent in the will's affirmation also leads to a form of existential nihilism. If life is primarily suffering, if pleasure is merely the fleeting cessation of pain, and if all striving is ultimately futile, then the very act of existing seems pointless. The individual's life has no ultimate significance beyond being a temporary manifestation of the universal will's suffering. This can lead to a sense of despair, apathy, or the feeling that nothing matters. However, while Schopenhauer's philosophy can certainly lead to nihilistic conclusions, he himself offers a radical escape from this despair, suggesting that the recognition of this meaninglessness is not the end, but the beginning of true wisdom. For him, the ultimate response to this nihilistic truth is not to succumb to it, but to actively deny the will to live. This act of denial is precisely what allows one to transcend the suffering and meaninglessness that the will perpetuates. By consciously turning away from all desires, attachments, and the affirmation of existence, the individual achieves a state of profound peace, a nirvana, which is beyond the realm of suffering and meaninglessness. In this sense, Schopenhauer's philosophy is not merely a description of nihilism, but an attempt to overcome it through a very specific, ascetic path. The knowledge that the world is meaningless and suffering-filled is not a cause for despair, but a catalyst for liberation. It is the realization that the pursuit of happiness within the world is futile, and thus, true peace must be sought outside of it, in the cessation of all willing. Nietzsche, as previously mentioned, was deeply influenced by Schopenhauer's exposure of the nihilistic implications of a world without God or inherent meaning. However, Nietzsche famously rejected Schopenhauer's proposed solution of denial, seeing it as a weakness, a retreat from life. Instead, Nietzsche advocated for an affirmation of life and suffering, proposing the will to power as a constructive response to nihilism, urging humanity to create its own values and meaning. But even in this disagreement, Nietzsche's struggle is with the very nihilistic abyss that Schopenhauer had so clearly illuminated. Furthermore, Schopenhauer's view on the intellect as subservient to the will contributes to this sense of meaninglessness. Our reason, which we might hope would reveal ultimate truths or purposes, is merely a tool for survival. It can rationalize the will's actions, but cannot find an inherent meaning beyond the will's own blind striving. This further undermines any traditional foundations for meaning and value based on a rational, benevolent universe. The meaning of life, for Schopenhauer, is thus inverted. It lies not in affirmation and fulfillment, but in recognition of suffering and the subsequent denial. The world is meaningful only insofar as it provides the context for the will's self-overcoming. Without the suffering, there would be no impetus for denial and thus no path to liberation. So while Schopenhauer paints a deeply pessimistic and nihilistic picture of the world as it is, he simultaneously offers a radical solution, turning the very despair into the foundation for a profound, albeit difficult, spiritual release. It is a philosophy that forces one to confront the abyss, not to wallow in it, but to find a way to transcend it. The recognition of nihilism becomes a necessary step on the path to ultimate freedom and peace, making his philosophy a kind of soteriological nihilism, a nihilism that points towards salvation. Schopenhauer's concept of solipsism and how he addresses it is a crucial point of contention and development within his philosophy, directly stemming from his initial premise: the world is my representation. If everything I know is merely a phenomenon within my consciousness, how can I be certain that other minds, other subjects, exist, or that there is anything at all beyond my own representations? This radical subjective idealism, taken to its extreme, would indeed lead to solipsism, the belief that only one's own mind is sure to exist. Schopenhauer acknowledges this philosophical problem. He admits that from a purely theoretical, intellectual standpoint, solipsism is irrefutable. We can never, through external observation or logical deduction, definitively prove the existence of another subject's consciousness, as all we ever perceive are their bodies and actions, which are, for us, merely representations. Their smiles, their words, their pain, these are all phenomena within our own mind. However, Schopenhauer argues that while theoretically irrefutable, solipsism is practically impossible to sustain and is intuitively rejected. The crucial move comes from his unique access to the thing in itself, the will. While my own body is a representation for my intellect, I also have an immediate inner awareness of it as my will. I experience my volitions directly, not as external phenomena, but as the very essence of my being. When my hand moves, I experience both the visual representation of the moving hand and the direct act of willing its movement. This provides a unique bridge. By analogy, I infer that just as my body is the objectification of my will, so too are other bodies, human and animal, objectifications of their will. Although I cannot experience their will directly, I can infer its existence from their actions and expressions, which are analogous to my own. When I see another person cry, I understand that their crying is an objectification of suffering, just as my own crying would be an objectification of my suffering will. This inference is not a logical proof, but an intuitive, empathetic recognition, a direct feeling. This empathetic recognition is the foundation of compassion Mitleid, which, as discussed, is the basis of his ethics. When I experience compassion for another, it means I have, however momentarily, overcome the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation that separates individuals in the phenomenal world. I recognize that the will animating the other person and causing their suffering is fundamentally the same will that animates me. Their suffering becomes, in a profound sense, my suffering. This shared suffering and the capacity for Mitleid are what practically refute solipsism for Schopenhauer. It's not a logical refutation, but an existential and ethical one. The very experience of empathy tells us that there are other subjects of willing and suffering beyond our own. The ethical imperative to alleviate the suffering of others implicitly confirms their existence as fellow manifestations of the universal will. Furthermore, the universal and singular nature of the will itself implicitly dissolves solipsism. If there is only one will that manifests in all phenomena, then my individual will is merely a particular expression of this greater underlying reality. The I that represents the world is itself a manifestation of the same cosmic will that constitutes all other beings. So, in a deeper metaphysical sense, we are all expressions of the one fundamental reality, which renders strict solipsism ultimately untenable in his system, even if it cannot be logically disproven from a purely representational standpoint. The shared suffering of all beings, the common ground of the will to live, connects us all and prevents us from truly believing we are alone in the universe. Our capacity to feel with others, to suffer with others, to act justly towards others, is the practical demonstration of the existence of other subjects and the underlying unity of the will. Thus, while he starts with an extreme form of subjective idealism, Schopenhauer effectively navigates away from the isolating implications of solipsism by grounding knowledge not just in intellectual representation, but in the immediate, introspective awareness of the will, and the subsequent empathetic recognition of the will in others. It is the heart, more than the head, that provides the necessary counter-argument to the intellectual possibility of solipsism. Schopenhauer's writings are replete with an underlying theory of genius that stands in stark contrast to his assessment of ordinary intellect and the common person. For him, genius is not merely a higher degree of intelligence or cleverness, but a qualitative leap, a fundamental difference in the operation of the intellect. The ordinary intellect, possessed by the vast majority of humanity, is enslaved by the individual will. Its primary function is pragmatic, to perceive objects, form concepts, and apply the principle of sufficient reason in order to serve the will's endless desires for food, shelter, reproduction, security, and social status. It is constantly engaged in the business of life, perpetually calculating and striving for personal advantage. This pragmatic orientation limits the ordinary intellect's capacity for objective understanding. It sees the world only in relation to its own will, filtering everything through the lens of personal interest. In contrast, the genius possesses an intellect that has, to a significant degree, liberated itself from the servitude of the individual will. This liberation allows the genius to transcend the principium individuacinus and the principle of sufficient reason, enabling them to engage in pure will-less contemplation. The genius is capable of momentarily detaching from their personal desires and practical concerns, becoming a pure subject of knowing, a mirror of the object, absorbed entirely in the perception of the Platonic ideas. While the ordinary intellect sees a particular tree and thinks about its utility, shade, wood, fruit, the genius contemplates the universal idea of treeness, its essential form, as a manifestation of the will at a particular grade. This capacity for objective, disinterested contemplation is the essence of genius. It is what allows the genius to perceive the eternal, unchanging forms that lie beyond the fleeting world of individual phenomena. This unique ability is the source of all true art, profound philosophy, and genuine scientific discovery. The artist, through their genius, captures and conveys these ideas in their work, allowing others to experience a similar, albeit mediated, liberation. The philosopher, through genius, directly apprehends the ultimate idea, the will itself, and articulates it. The scientist, in moments of true insight, grasps the universal laws that govern phenomena, which are themselves manifestations of the ideas. However, this liberation comes at a cost. Because the genius's intellect is less subservient to their individual will, they often struggle with the practical demands of everyday life. They may be less adept at navigating social conventions, accumulating wealth, or attending to mundane tasks. Their profound detachment from the immediate concerns of the will can make them appear eccentric, impractical, or even socially awkward. Schopenhauer often felt himself to be such a figure, misunderstood by the world and isolated by his intellectual pursuits. The very sensitivity that enables deep insight can also make the genius more susceptible to suffering, as they are more acutely aware of the pervasive suffering of the will and the futility of human striving. The genius is essentially an anomaly, a rare manifestation where the will has created an organ, the intellect, that has the potential to turn against its creator, to understand and ultimately deny the will that brought it into being. It is the intellect realizing its own true purpose, which is not merely to serve the individual will, but to attain pure knowledge and ultimately to point towards the path of liberation from the will. For Schopenhauer, the genius represents the highest potential of humanity, the possibility of transcending the miserable condition of the ordinary will-driven individual. It is through the genius that humanity gains access to profound truths and moments of aesthetic liberation. The genius is the exception that proves the rule of the will's pervasive influence, demonstrating that there is a way, however difficult and rare, to momentarily or even ultimately escape its dominion. This concept of genius is highly aristocratic and elitist, reflecting Schopenhauer's disdain for the herd and his belief that profound truths are accessible only to a select few. It explains why he felt so alienated from academic philosophy and the popular intellectual currents of his time. True philosophical insight for him was not something that could be taught or acquired through mere effort. It required a fundamental, innate capacity, a spark of genius, that allowed one to see beyond the veil of appearances. This theory reinforces his overall system, placing the capacity for liberation in the hands of a rare few who are able to break free from the will's ordinary grasp and, through their unique cognitive abilities, pave the way for a deeper understanding of reality for all. Schopenhauer's philosophy, despite its grand metaphysical scope, also profoundly influenced his understanding of human nature and morality. He posited that at its core, human nature is driven by the same blind, irrational will to live that animates all existence. This means that egoism is the fundamental impulse of every individual. Each person's will strives for its own assertion, its own perpetuation, its own pleasure, often without regard for others. This inherent egoism is the root of all conflict, cruelty, and injustice in the world. It is the reason for the war of all against all. For Schopenhauer, true moral action does not arise from reason, divine command, or social contract, but from a profound and immediate feeling of compassion, Mitleid. This compassion emerges when an individual's intellect momentarily transcends the principium individuationis, the principle that separates individuals and makes us perceive ourselves as distinct entities. In a moment of compassion, one recognizes that the suffering of another being is, in essence, one's own suffering, because all individuals are ultimately manifestations of the same universal will. The veil of Maya, which separates me from you, is momentarily lifted, revealing the underlying metaphysical unity. When one truly feels Mitleid, one ceases to act solely from egoism. The other person's suffering becomes a direct motive for action, leading to benevolence, justice, and self-sacrifice. This is the only genuine source of morality, an intuitive insight, an emotional response, not a rational calculation. Actions motivated by egoism, even if they appear moral, are ultimately not truly ethical, according to Schopenhauer. For instance, giving to charity out of a desire for reputation is not a moral act, it is merely an egoistic one. A truly moral act stems from the direct feeling of sympathy with another's pain. This emphasis on compassion makes him a notable figure in ethical philosophy, distinguishing him from rationalist and utilitarian traditions. However, even compassion, while noble, only alleviates suffering within the framework of the will's affirmation. It does not address the root cause of suffering itself. Therefore, the highest moral ideal and ultimate liberation from suffering lies in the denial of the will to live. This is the ascetic path, where the individual consciously and systematically turns away from all desires, pleasures, and attachments to the phenomenal world. It is an act of self-negation, a quietistic rejection of the will's constant striving. This denial is not motivated by egoism, e.g., desiring one's own peace, but by a profound insight into the futility and suffering inherent in the will's affirmation. It is the will, in its highest manifestation, the human intellect, realizing its own painful nature and consciously opting for its own cessation. This radical ethical path leads to a state of profound peace and tranquility, a nirvana, where the individual is freed from the endless cycle of desire and suffering. This state is beyond the ordinary concepts of good and evil, as it transcends the very will that gives rise to such distinctions. Schopenhauer also explored the concept of character, arguing that each individual's character is unchangeable and innate, their intelligible character. Our actions are determined by this character interacting with external motives. We are free to do what we will, but not to will what we will. This deterministic view of empirical action means that moral responsibility lies not in the choice of a particular action, but in the character itself. A bad person performs bad deeds because their character is bad. A compassionate person acts benevolently because their character is inclined towards Mitleid. The true freedom, as discussed, lies in the metaphysical possibility of denying the will itself, a single, decisive act that transcends empirical causality and fundamentally alters one's being. Furthermore, Schopenhauer's analysis of human nature is deeply pessimistic. He sees humans as inherently driven by insatiable desires, condemned to a cycle of suffering and prone to egoism, malice, and cruelty. Society and laws are merely artificial constructs to curb these destructive tendencies, not to foster genuine harmony. This bleak view of human nature stands in stark contrast to optimistic Enlightenment ideals of human perfectibility or inherent goodness. He believed that the vast majority of humanity remains trapped in the affirmation of the will, seeking fleeting pleasures and worldly success, oblivious to the deeper truth of suffering and the path to liberation. Only a rare few, those with the capacity for profound insight and the strength for asceticism, can escape this predicament. In summary, Schopenhauer's human nature is fundamentally driven by an irrational will leading to pervasive egoism and suffering. Morality finds its sole genuine source in compassion, which is a fleeting transcendence of individuation. The ultimate ethical aspiration, however, is the complete denial of the will, leading to liberation from the tragic human condition. This provides a deeply challenging, yet systematically coherent view of what it means to be human in a world governed by a blind, suffering force.